Welcome to this deep dive, where we explore the most impactful insights from the sources you share with us. Okay, so let's unpack this. Today, we are immersing ourselves in, well, it's one of the most intense spiritual biographies ever written. We're looking at the diary of David Brainerd.
Hmm.
And this is just a primary document that gives you an unparalleled window into the religious fervor of the 18th century Great Awakening.
It really does, and we're focusing on a very specific, very concentrated period.
Exactly. We're focusing on the time when his calling was really being forged. Just a few months of theological study that were less about memorizing facts and more about a kind of spiritual combustion.
And we should be really precise about our source here. This is a deep dive based on a summary of the Life of Rev David Brainerd, chiefly extracted from his diary by President Edwards, Chapter 2.
Great.
Now, this summary is created with the help of AI, but, and this is the key part, it was specifically instructed to stay so close to the original chapter that what you're getting is a near one-to-one representation of Brainerd's inner life.
So we're hearing his own words, his own thoughts as they happened.
We are essentially reading the raw data of a soul in transformation during these critical months from April through July of 1742.
And this chapter, chapter 2, it covers the period when Brainerd went to live with the Reverend Mr. Mills of Ripton. He's preparing for the ministry, but this is right after his public disgrace at Yale.
A huge factor.
So it's a period marked not just by academic work, but by these profound spiritual highs and, just devastating lows. Our mission here is to really understand that white-hot fervor, the absolute devotion, and the profound and, let's be honest, often challenging humility that defined his calling before he ever even met the Native Americans he was called to serve.
Exactly. You know, we aren't just looking at the calendar of a hopeful minister. We are documenting the minute-by-minute internal calibration of his soul.
That's a great way to put it.
It's a soul that is perpetually struggling for holiness and for assurance. So let's start right at the beginning of this period, April 1st, 1742.
So, the moment Brainerd begins this new phase of intense study, you'd think he'd start with excitement, maybe some confidence, but he doesn't.
No, not at all.
He starts with immediate deep discouragement. He writes about feeling, quote, declining with respect to my life and warmth in divine things.
And to a modern ear, the word declining sounds, well, it sounds like he's just tired. Maybe a little bit of spiritual backsliding.
Right, like he missed a day of his quiet time or something.
But in the context of 18th century Puritan spirituality, declining is a crisis. It's a full-blown emergency. It suggests a movement away from the palpable, felt presence of God.
So it's a loss of that emotional zeal that really defined the whole Great Awakening experience.
Precisely. And what's immediately striking is that this discouragement, it doesn't lead him to question his actions, like, what did I do wrong? It leads him to question his very essence, his love for God.
Wow.
His spiritual decline is just more proof to him of his own fundamental baseline inability to be good.
That is profoundly self-critical language right from the jump. What does that tell us about the standards he was measuring himself against? Because he immediately turns that self-recrimination into this deep theological contemplation.
The standards are impossibly high.
Listen to the quote he uses on April 1st to really set the stage for this entire chapter. He says, I deserve hell every day for not loving my Lord more, who has, I trust, loved me and given himself for me.
And there it is. The standard he's measuring himself against is nothing less than divine perfection. It's a perfect reciprocal love for the Savior, who, he believes, died for him. This isn't just guilt, you see. This is the core foundation of Edward Vasian and Calvinistic thought.
The doctrine of utter sovereign dependency.
Exactly. His lack of warmth isn't a failure of his effort. For him, it's proof of his total dependence on something outside of himself. He understands that even having faith, that very belief that Christ loved him and gave himself for him, is itself a gift he didn't earn.
And he emphasizes this immediately. He articulates this crucial theological point. He says, every single exercise of grace, every moment of warmth, every good desire is renewedly indebted to the God of all grace for special assistance.
That phrase, special assistance, is everything. It runs completely contrary to the emerging Arminian trends of the era, which were putting a lot more emphasis on human free will and cooperation in salvation.
So we have to pause here, right? We need to understand the theological stakes. The 18th century was a battlefield for these ideas.
It really was. Arminianism suggested that salvation involves some kind of human merit or, a human choice that gets the ball rolling. Brainerd, who is steeped in the Great Awakening revivalism that Jonathan Edwards championed, he insists on sovereign grace.
Meaning if you felt joy or holiness today.
He knows he is entirely reliant on God delivering a new, fresh dose of spiritual power for that moment. And if he declined tomorrow, well, that just proved what his own nature was really like without that assistance.
So if grace is completely sovereign and freely given by God, what space is left for human pride? For boasting?
Absolutely none. And that leads directly to his powerful conclusion about boasting. It makes any sense of self-merit completely impossible. He asks the question, where then is boasting?
And the answer is,
Surely it is excluded because, he says, we are dependent on God for the existence in every act of grace. Brainerd knows that if he successfully maintains his spiritual life for even 1 hour, it is not his effort. It is God's special assistance renewed for that specific hour. He's just the receptacle.
it's this profound spiritual equation, isn't it? The more he strives for perfection, the more he recognizes his own failure.
And the more that failure points him back to the absolute necessity of outside divine intervention, this dependency, it becomes this almost, well, this comforting philosophical loop for him.
It's his only comfort.
It is. He sees the fleeting nature of his own spiritual energy as proof that it must come from outside himself. And this rejection of merit culminates in one of his most humbling confessions from that very first day.
He says, if ever I get to heaven, it will be because God pleases and nothing else. For I never did anything of myself but get away from God.
I mean, just think about that phrasing. He characterizes his own natural trajectory as constant spiritual drift, a constant moving away from God.
So his only hope, then, is rooted not in his performance, not in his spiritual checklist, but entirely in divine pleasure. It's a truly evocative picture, isn't it? The believer as a ship that is constantly sailing off course, unless an outside force, the wind of the Spirit, intervenes.
Exactly. And his ultimate conclusion, based on this overwhelming sense of unworthiness, is that when he finally arrives in heaven, his soul will be astonished at the unsearchable riches of divine grace.
That phrase, unsearchable riches of divine grace, it feels like the ultimate resolution to that initial discouragement he felt.
It is, because the deeper his sense of his own vileness, the more immense, the more glorious, and the more literally unsearchable the perceived grace must be to cover it. The whole spiritual system he inhabits works to strip him of self-reliance.
Leaving only awe.
Only awe. And for you, the listener, trying to grasp the intensity of this era, this deep humility is the absolute key. Spiritual joy for Brainerd is rooted in deep, often agonizing humility, not in self-satisfaction or hitting some spiritual metric.
And this intense self-assessment, it doesn't stay abstract. It quickly leads to these moments of profound awe. Just a week later, on April 9th, he says he feels more amazed than ever at such thoughts. For I see myself infinitely vile and unworthy.
He doubles down. He doesn't just feel vile. He feels infinitely vile.
Right. Then he adds, no poor creature stands in need of divine grace more than I, and none abuse it more than I have done, and still do. He sees himself as the spiritual debtor, and the debt is just growing faster than he could ever hope to pay it.
And that ability to sustain that feeling of simultaneously seeing his own profound vileness and the immense, dazzling glory of God's grace, that's what allows him to move into the next phase of his calling with such ferocious zeal.
Because he's internalized that he has nothing to lose?
He has nothing to lose because he possesses nothing of his own merit to begin with.
Okay, so moving past that foundation of humility, we hit this powerful central tension point in Brainerd's inner life. It's a dual desire that seems, on the surface, almost contradictory.
It's a paradox.
He is pulled violently in two directions. On one hand, he longs for immediate release and death to be with Christ. And on the other, he burns with this incredible zeal for grueling, painful labor among the unreached, the heathen, as he calls them.
It is an incredible spiritual paradox. And you see it right away. Look at April 2nd. This is just one day after his profound reflection on his own vileness. That inner turmoil leads directly to a longing for rest.
He describes a really sharp shift in desire. He says, sometime past I had much pleasure in the prospect of the heathen being brought home to Christ, and desired that the Lord would employ me in that work, but now my soul more frequently desires to die to be with Christ.
So the question is why?
Yeah.
Why the sudden shift towards wanting to die? And you have to understand, in 18th century spiritual framework, the chief barrier to loving God perfectly was what he called indwelling sin, the body of death that he was constantly complaining about.
So death was the only escape.
The only permanent escape from sin, the only place where he could love Christ without the distraction of his own imperfection, was in heaven. So the immediate desire for death is really a longing for release from the constant struggle against his sinful self and what he calls this lower world.
That reframes it completely. It helps you see the desire to die not as something pathological or, self-destructive, but as a longing for ultimate perfect sanctification.
Yes, that's the
A
term.
term we'll definitely explore more, but it's a desire for immediate union with the object of his affection.
Precisely. His soul is longing to be, in his words, wrapped up in divine love. And this is so clear in where he finds immediate comfort in the middle of this internal storm. He says, what are all the storms of this lower world if Jesus, by his Spirit, does but come walking on the seas?
So he finds peace in the assurance of God's presence. It makes all the trials of earth feel irrelevant.
For a time. But the missionary impulse, that zeal for the advancement of Christ's kingdom here on earth, it's just too strong to be suppressed for long. The external mission is the practical expression of that internal love.
And it comes roaring back just 4 days later on April 6th. After a time of crying to God for cleansing, he begins to find it sweet to pray.
And not just sweet, but empowering. He says he could think of undergoing the greatest sufferings in the cause of Christ with pleasure.
With pleasure. That phrase just leaps off the page. It speaks volumes about his psychological state. The willingness to suffer becomes this strange, almost paradoxical form of joy for him.
And he spells out the extent of that sacrifice. He's not thinking in abstract terms.
Yeah, this is very concrete. He gives this incredible quote that really defines his entire missionary focus. He says he found himself willing, if God should so order it, to suffer banishment from my native land among the heathen, that I might do something for their salvation in distresses and deaths of any kind.
I mean, that is a total surrender.
Yeah.
A total surrender of comfort, of status, of safety. This is a very real prospect for him, given the dangers of 18th century frontier work, disease, the general hostility toward missionary efforts.
The phrase suffer banishment in distresses and deaths of any kind means he fully accepts the possibility of a short, miserable life, far from any comfort he's ever known.
So this raises that critical question that the source really presses on you as the listener. How can one person simultaneously desire the perfect rest and immediate union found in death, and also desire such rigorous, painful, and potentially deadly service?
What's the connection?
It highlights that both desires, as contradictory as they seem, they flow from the exact same singular source, a desire for the glory of Christ. Brainerd sees two paths to achieving that glory,
Okay.
either through his personal rest in the heavenly world, that's his desire for death, or through intense labor and suffering on earth to save souls. That's his desire for missionary work. Both are expressions of ultimate loyalty.
So the world's opinion, the world's comforts, they're completely negated by this singular focus on purpose.
Completely. And you see that oscillating focus so vividly on April 8th. His hopes are suddenly raised respecting the heathen. He becomes convinced he will see that glorious day when they are brought to Christ.
And this external mission, this grand vision, it makes everything else in his life, including himself, seem exceeding vile and little. It's a really effective antidote to self-pity, isn't it?
It's the perfect antidote. When you're focused on a cosmic, eternal cause, the redemption of nations, your petty concerns about your status or your daily comfort, they just disappear. This singular focus elevates him above the immediate circumstances of his study.
But even this zeal isn't constant. It slumps temporarily. We see him feeling depressed of late, respecting my hopes of future serviceableness.
Doubt creeps in. Doubt about his ability to actually do the work he so intensely desires. It's the spiritual fatigue of knowing the task is immense, and his own resources, his human strength, his merit are so meager.
So he has to rely on an outside force to overcome that doubt. And that happens on April 12th. The Lord, as he says, lifts his countenance, and it transforms his outlook completely.
The change is immediate. He says, "This morning the Lord was pleased to lift up the light of his countenance upon me in secret prayer, and made the season very precious to my soul." This encouragement is absolutely crucial. It's the divine confirmation he needs to keep going.
And that moment leads to this tremendous spiritual surge where his sense of doubt is entirely overthrown by faith. Brainerd describes his faith almost like it's a physical ability.
It's a tool, a muscle.
Yes, he says, my faith lifted me above the world and removed all those mountains over which of late I could not look. And if you think of those mountains as all the obstacles,
His past disgrace at Yale.
his perceived unworthiness, the daunting challenge of frontier life, faith literally clears his vision.
And the resolution that follows is one of perfect surrender to whatever assignment is coming. He specifically rejects the temptation of seeking human support, which is, a huge temptation for anyone preparing for public ministry.
He makes a powerful statement on this. He says he didn't want the favor of man to lean upon. For I knew that Christ's favor was infinitely better,
Infinitely better.
and that it was no matter when, nor where, nor how Christ should send me, nor what trials he should still exercise me with, if I might be prepared for his work and will.
And this, right here, this is the ultimate proof of his spiritual maturity in this phase. His motivation is now completely detached from seeking human acclaim or earthly comfort.
His anxiety about future service is cured not by a promise of easy success, but by a perfect acceptance of whatever difficulty God might send.
As long as he was spiritually prepared, that preparation is the only thing that matters.
Mm.
And that leads us directly to the practical daily labor required to achieve it.
So, if the first two sections established a why, this deep humility and the burning missionary desire, this next section really details the how. That immense calling to the heathen demanded not just spiritual willpower, it demanded a physical commitment. Brainerd's spiritual life was defined by an intensely and often physically demanding prayer life, especially during his set days for fasting and intercession. And this wasn't, polite kneeling. This was agonizing full-body labor.
He saw prayer as wrestling, like Jacob wrestling with the angel in the Old Testament. It was a commitment of the entire person, body and soul, to what he saw as spiritual warfare. For him, intercession, the act of praying on behalf of others, was a labor of love. And labor requires effort, often painful effort.
And he sets aside specific days just for this. On April 19th, he sets apart a day for fasting and prayer specifically for preparation for the ministry, seeking divine aid and direction.
He felt some life in the morning, he says, but you can feel the intensity building throughout the day, and it's driven by his contemplation of the lost.
Right. As the day wears on, he feels the power of intercession for precious immortal souls. And he feels a sweet resignation and even consolation and joy in the thoughts of suffering, hardships, distresses, and even death itself in promoting the kingdom.
The thought of suffering for the cause brings him consolation. It's so counterintuitive. But then we get to the detail that it shocks a modern sensibility.
It really does. Listen to this description of his physical state during this mental and emotional exertion. God enabled me so to agonize in prayer that I was quite wet with sweat, though in the shade and the cool wind.
So, to a modern audience, this level of physical exertion, sweating profusely while you're sitting in the cool shade, it sounds almost pathological. Or maybe it indicates an extreme, potentially unhealthy personal commitment.
Right, you tell him to go see a doctor.
But in his tradition, this physical manifestation was seen as proof of sincerity and deep spiritual engagement. This was not mere meditation. This was spiritual wrestling. It was his Gethsemane.
The intensity of his spiritual struggle manifested so powerfully that it overwhelmed his body's ability to regulate its own temperature, even in ideal conditions.
It communicates a man so wholly consumed by the duty that his physical body is simply secondary to the immense spiritual work he's attempting to perform.
And the scope of his intercession was just vast. He says he grasped for multitudes of souls, and that he felt more enlargement for sinners, specifically for the conversion of the poor heathen, than he did for the already converted children of God.
And that's a direct insight into his missionary heart. It explains the reason for the agony. He is laboring for those who have no advocate in his view, those who are furthest from the light. And the suffering and prayer leads directly to perfect peace and detachment.
The result of this physically draining session on April 19th is equally profound. He says, I think I never in my life felt such an entire weanedness from this world and so much resigned to God in everything. The agony strips him of his worldly ties.
But this wasn't a one-off event. This level of intensity was the standard he set for himself. It reached an even greater peak on June 14th. Another day of secret fasting and prayer, undertaking to seek direction and to have the Lord show me the light of his countenance.
And he struggles at first, right? He finds little life and power in the forenoon, which is a reminder that this power isn't something he can just generate by his own will.
No, it has to be given. And God, in his words, visits him marvelously in prayer just before dark. And the description is repeated, but it's amplified.
The intensity is even greater this time. He records, I think my soul never was in such an agony before. I was in such an agony from half an hour before sunset till near dark that I was all over wet with sweat.
The repetition of that physical detail, the sweat, it confirms the consistency of his deep emotional commitment. But now he has a standard to measure it against.
And that standard is Christ.
Yes. The most revealing comparison he draws is when he considers the intensity of his own agony versus the ultimate standard of redemptive suffering. He immediately minimizes his own experience. He says, oh, my dear Savior did sweat blood for poor souls. I longed for more compassion toward them.
So even when he is literally drenched in sweat from wrestling in prayer for others, he falls short of Christ's example.
It's a crucial pivot. His agony is not a mark of completion for him. It's a mark of the distance between him and the perfection of Christ's suffering. He feels inadequate in his compassion, even while he's literally suffering physically on behalf of others.
This willingness to physically suffer in prayer shows how profoundly he valued what he called the sweet duty of intercession back on April 21st.
He saw prayer not just as a petition, but as a participation in the suffering required for the redemption of souls. It was a rigorous, demanding profession in and of itself.
And yet, despite this immense struggle, the day is followed by this reflection of profound dissatisfaction on June 15th. Even after feeling so wholly devoted to God, he is not satisfied with his frames.
And that's a key 18th century term. A frame is your internal emotional state of devotion.
He says, I am not satisfied with my frames, nor feel at all more easy after such strugglings than before, for it seems far too little, if I could always be so. Oh, how short do I fall of my duty in my sweetest moments.
This is the pursuit of holiness taken to its absolute logical extreme. Brainerd measures his devotion not against the standard of other men or even his own previous experiences, but against the impossible standard of Christ's perfection. This ongoing dissatisfaction is the engine of his spiritual life.
He was never content to rest on a past spiritual high.
Never. He was constantly striving forward, and he was fueled by the gap between his own best effort and Christ's perfect example.
Now, to maintain that level of agonizing devotion, there have to be moments of profound relief and connection. If we were to chart Brainerd's inner life, the highs are truly astronomical.
They have to be.
So this section focuses on those moments of what he calls ineffable comfort, where he felt closest to God and the resulting total disdain for all worldly comforts.
These moments are the necessary counterpoint to the agony. The intense labor in prayer yields these moments of profound, unmerited rest and communion. They're the moments that sustain him through the valleys of discouragement. On April 25th, for example, Brainerd says he is exceedingly melted with divine love.
And he finds particular sweetness in reflecting on Psalm 84, verse 7. They go from strength to strength. Every one of them in Zion appeareth before God.
He sees that concept of moving from strength to strength and appearing before God as relating directly to the access and the intimate, joyous communion he is currently experiencing. He's being spiritually fortified.
And what is his highest desire during this time of spiritual clarity? It's not earthly success or even the immediate conversion of the heathen. It's spiritual transformation for its own sake.
Yes, the focus turns completely inward.
His longing is singular. All I want is to be more holy, more like my dear Lord. Oh, for sanctification. My very soul pants for the complete restoration of the blessed image of my Savior.
Let's break down that term sanctification for you, the listener. Brainerd isn't just seeking to feel good. He's seeking to literally become good. He wants to be remade in the moral image of Christ.
So it's not just forgiveness for past sins.
That's justification. This is different. This is the progressive, daily transformation of his character. That's sanctification. The enjoyment of God, he understands, is inseparable from being made holy enough to actually appreciate that God.
And this desire for complete conformity, it just pushes the world completely to the background. He even records poetry in his diary, marking these moments of ultimate disdain for the vain world.
The lines he pens are striking.
Farewell, vain world, my soul can bid adieu. Your beauties fade, my heart's no room for you. He's longing for the perfected city, the New Jerusalem, and the Song of Moses and the Lamb.
He is attempting to live an eternal life now by stripping away all affection for temporal things. And the most intense spiritual communion, the absolute pinnacle of this chapter, is described on April 27th.
He retired early, he says, and he experienced what he calls ineffable comforts. God was pleased to pour such ineffable comforts into my soul that I could do nothing for some time but say over and over, O my sweet Savior, whom have I in heaven but thee, and there is none upon earth that I desire beside thee.
Ineffable. The word itself means too great or extreme to be expressed or described in words. That is the language of total spiritual saturation.
He's so overwhelmed that human speech fails him. He can only resort to repetition.
He also states that if he had 1,000 lives, he would gladly have laid them all down at once to have been with Christ. It's a sense of bliss so complete, so satisfying, that everything else becomes utterly meaningless.
He calls it the most refined and most spiritual season of communion with God I ever yet felt.
And this elevated state immediately translates into a practical indifference to the world. We see it carry over into the next day, April 28th. This is the ultimate test of his faith. not just finding comfort in God, but finding total satisfaction only in God. This is where his spiritual philosophy hits the real world.
On April 28th, Brainerd continues, God was so precious to me that the world, with all its enjoyments, was infinitely vile. I had no more value for the favor of men than for pebbles.
Now, just think about that statement for a second. He's training for public ministry, the favor of men, the approval of the church, the respect of his peers, the potential for a comfortable living. That is the currency of his profession.
And he says he values it no more than little stones on the ground.
Exactly. The Lord was his all. This spiritual assurance was so strong that he momentarily achieved a level of faith where he thought it seemed impossible I should distrust him again or be any way anxious about anything that should happen to me.
He felt this perfect confidence in God's sovereignty, that he overruled all, greatly delighted me. He was totally weaned from all other dependencies.
And yet, the diary immediately provides the inevitable counterpoint. Even in this state of divine assurance, the shadow of indwelling sin remains.
Right. Though he did not doubt God's love, he went to bed with a heavy heart because I was a sinner.
He could bid welcome to all other trials, reproach, hardship, death, but sin that hung heavy upon him. The experience of heaven on earth only amplified his awareness of his own imperfection, which, of course, set him up for the next valley.
As we've established, the spiritual pendulum for Brainerd never stays at the high point. This next section captures the inevitable counterpoint to all that sweetness, the renewed sense of indwelling sin, despair, and the burden of external trials. We really have to understand the spiritual low to appreciate just how high the peaks were.
That's right. The moment Brainerd stops actively receiving that special assistance of grace, he immediately feels the corruption of his own heart.
The severity of the conflict that follows such great comforts is really key to understanding the nature of 18th century piety, isn't it?
It is. The lack of constant, acute spiritual intensity was itself interpreted as a spiritual failure, a failure of love. And that leads immediately back to self-loathing.
So after the sweetness of April, we jump to May 13th, and the self-loathing returns with a vengeance. He was visiting Wethersfield. He couldn't find a convenient place for retirement, for his devotions, and that lack of spiritual discipline, that interruption of his routine, immediately exposed his inner state.
And he describes what he discovers inside himself.
He says he saw so much of the wickedness of my heart that I longed to get away from myself. I never before thought that there was so much spiritual pride in my soul. I felt almost pressed to death with my own vileness.
And that's a crushing recognition for him. Spiritual pride, the temptation to take credit for his zeal or his agonizing prayer, is the one sin that undermines all other spiritual achievements.
The more zealous he is, the more opportunities spiritual pride has to creep in, whispering that he's better than others.
Right. He recognizes the greatness of his own body of death, which is a Pauline term referring to the pervasive, corrupting influence of sin that remains even after conversion. And this internal struggle is just exhausting for him.
And he concludes that the ultimate cure isn't seeking more intense mountaintop experiences, but simply returning to steady, disciplined devotion. He writes, "Oh, the closest walk with God is the sweetest heaven that can be enjoyed on earth." It's a return to the basics.
We see that even when he's assured of God's love, sin remains his greatest trial. But the spiritual conflict, it reaches its most dreadful point on June 30th.
And this follows that intense, sweating agony of intercession we discussed earlier, which is a brutal reminder that intense effort does not guarantee spiritual ease.
No, it doesn't.
He spent this day alone in the woods, fasting and praying, undergoing the most dreadful conflicts in my soul. The despair is complete. He saw himself as so vile that he was ready to say, "I shall now perish by the hand of Saul."
He's referencing the biblical King David's moment of utter hopelessness and fear of persecution. That is utter despair. And it leads to a profound sense of incapacity for service. He thought that I had no power to stand for the cause of God, but was almost afraid of the shaking of a leaf.
He was almost lost in the woods, he says, mentally and spiritually. He couldn't feel hope even for the heathen, which was the one thing that usually sustained him. He spent the entire day in bitterness of soul. It's a complete psychological and spiritual breakdown.
And to compound this internal misery, there were external trials as well, which Brainerd was always keenly aware of, particularly because they threatened his utility in ministry.
And the biggest, most persistent external trial was the disgrace of his previous expulsion from Yale.
This is a critical point that needs context for you, the listener. Brainerd was expelled from Yale College in 1742 for criticizing the administration and faculty, specifically for saying that one of his tutors has no more grace than a chair.
Which was not a popular opinion to share.
No, it was an act of insubordination driven by the Great Awakening fervor, where radical evangelicals like Brainerd believed that spiritual experience, not just academic credentials, should be the prerequisite for ministry. Yale's establishment, who were fearful of the revival's enthusiasm, punished him severely.
So, his external failure, being thrown out of the premier institution for preparing ministers, it magnified his internal struggle with spiritual pride. The moment he doubted his own worthiness, the external label of expelled student provided instant confirmation of his failure.
Exactly. On July 3rd, he acknowledges this ongoing pressure. He says the disgrace seemed to damp my spirits as it opens the mouths of opposers.
The established anti-revival ministers could easily point to his failure at Yale as proof that his zeal was false or disorderly.
His only recourse against both internal vileness and external slander was perfect resignation. He writes, "I had no refuge but in God. Blessed be his name, that I may go to him at all times and find him a help." This whole sequence of conflict, internal despair, validated by external reproach, is key to understanding the purifying fire of Brainerd's faith.
He concludes that the desertions and trials were not punishments, but were made a means of making me more humble and much more resigned, as he realizes the very next day, July 4th. The hardship had a specific therapeutic purpose.
That Lord's Day, July 4th, provides the powerful resolution to the conflict. He enjoys a happy season in secret prayer, feeling the invisible world near. But the amazing thing is his attitude toward the recent suffering.
He felt thankfulness to God for all my pressing desertions of late, and you have to ask why the thankfulness.
Because they fostered the humility he needed. He felt pleased to be little, to be nothing, and to lie in the dust. The suffering achieved its purpose. It brought him to a state of total self-negation, which paradoxically was the pathway back to joy.
This resignation demonstrates the purifying effect of hardship. He's brought to a place where he can accept total insignificance in the eyes of the world, so long as his soul breathes after holiness and the enjoyment of God.
The disgrace at Yale, his failure in the eyes of men, it becomes irrelevant because he is utterly resigned to God's will, regardless of the cost. He ends this severe period with a fervent plea, "Oh, come, Lord Jesus, come quickly," signaling his renewed longing for perfect union and service.
So, this chapter concludes by resolving the central conflict that defined the preceding 4 months. Brainerd's fitness and ability to enter the ministry, the agonizing prayer, the constant cycling between vileness and comfort, and all the trials, they all led to this single critical moment that would determine his future.
And this combination happens on July 29th, the final entry we have in this chapter. It's so important for you to remember that this examination for licensure was not just a test of his intellectual capacity in theology.
No, it was a test of his entire spiritual history, the very things he documented so meticulously in his diary.
Right. For the association meeting at Danbury, outward knowledge was insufficient without inward experience.
The critical moment arrives on July 29th. He writes, "I was examined by the association met at Danbury as to my learning and also my experience in religion, and received a license from them to preach the gospel of Christ."
And you have to notice the dual nature of that examination. His learning, that's the theological study with Reverend Mr. Mills, and his experience in religion. This latter part is where his diary truly serves as his qualification.
The elders didn't just ask what he knew, they examined who he was. They reviewed the depth and legitimacy of his conversion and his zeal.
So the entire process of agonizing in the woods, wrestling with spiritual pride, and declaring the world as pebbles, that qualified him, where his academic record, the Yale expulsion, previously disqualified him.
The association looked past the public disgrace of the Yale expulsion, the very thing that opened the mouths of opposers, and they affirmed his genuine calling based on the depth of his surrender and his clear sense of mission. It's a profound spiritual victory over the perceived failure of his past.
And his immediate response to receiving the license isn't pride, it's renewed devotion, which is completely consistent with his character. The fear of spiritual pride is immediately quelled by renewed surrender.
Brainerd concludes the period with this firm commitment. He felt much devoted to God, joined in prayer with one of the ministers, my peculiar friend, in a convenient place, and went to bed resolving to live devoted to God all my days.
And let's connect this all the way back to April 1st. He began this chapter feeling declining, totally unworthy, dependent on unsearchable grace, and so anxious about his future service.
And 4 months later?
4 months later, he is licensed and commissioned to preach that very gospel. The synthesis provided by his journey shows that he wasn't judged fit based on superficial knowledge, but based on a demonstrable, agonizing struggle toward holiness and complete surrender. Those were the true qualifications for ministry in this tradition.
The journey itself proves the very unsearchable riches of divine grace he spoke of at the beginning.
It does. And, we have spent time in the mind of a man who pursued his spiritual vocation with absolute physical intensity. Brainerd's commitment was total, agonizing, sweating, fasting, and living above the world, discarding worldly favor for the favor of Christ.
So, given this level of absolute internal sacrifice, this willingness to suffer physically in pursuit of his calling, what level of internal sacrifice and total commitment do we truly reserve for the things we claim are most valuable in our own lives today?
That is the final provocative question Brainerd's diary presses upon us. It demands we examine the sincerity of our own values.
What stands out to you from Brainerd's journey in these few months? We've witnessed a man live an entire lifetime of intense faith between April and July, defined by both overwhelming vileness and ineffable comfort, always driving him back to utter dependence on grace.
And preparing him for the great, difficult missionary work ahead that would define his very short life.
For you, the listener, this deep dive provides not just historical facts about 18th century spirituality, but a powerful and, I think, challenging example of spiritual discipline and the pursuit of holiness.
It's knowledge that transforms your understanding of internal life through the documentation of total surrender. It shows that the path to service is often paved with spiritual agony.
If you found these insights into Brainerd's deep spiritual life valuable, and you want more deep dives that condense complex sources into clear, impactful knowledge, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss another discussion. We'll be ready to unpack your next set of sources whenever you are.